Yeah, my name is Josh Meadow, and it's really an honor to introduce our next speaker, Rick Doblin. He's already been mentioned a few times today and last year at the conference, even though he wasn't one of our speakers. He got mentioned a lot because he's really a pioneer and a crusader in this scene. And if there was really one person we have to thank for this modern psychedelic renaissance that we're going through right now, it's Rick. He started MAPS in 1986, which is 34 years ago. And that's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I think most of us probably know about some of their work. And we're really now finally starting to see the fruits of all of Rick's labor, as MDMA-assisted therapy is really now poised to become a legal part of our medical system. And I believe has the potential to really revolutionize mental health and psychotherapy. And I feel like the big question and challenge on everyone's mind right now that's already come up a little bit today and in this sort of psychedelic conversation is not so much when psychedelics are entering mainstream society, because that's happening, but how it's going to happen. Decriminalization, legalization, medicalization, issues of commodification around that, a lot of Asians. And MAPS is really playing a major role, not just in actually changing policy, but helping to really envision these new systems for how to integrate these tools into modern society. So Rick, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Josh. It's great to talk together on this Saturday with all the people here. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. And just a reminder to people, you can submit your Q&A for Rick. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. That's through meet.ps, and we'll post the link for that again. So Rick, obviously we are in an unprecedented global crisis right now, maybe you've heard. And of course there's a lot of suffering and grief there in that, but I think a lot of us who have been critical of the old societal systems and structures are really actually seeing an opportunity here, kind of an exposure in the cracks of a system that really hasn't been working, and perhaps an opening to bring some of these new systems and tools and ways of thinking into fruition. So my question is, how do you see the current global crisis affecting the future of psychedelic medicine?
Well, I think it's going to help tremendously in multiple different ways. So the first way to say is that because of the financial crisis, governments all over the world are going to start to reevaluate the drug war. And why are we spending so much time to criminalize people and so much money to do that when we could legalize these drugs and make a lot of tax money? So I think the zeal for the drug war is going to go down. The interest in legalizing these drugs for recreational use, for non-medical use is going to go up for tax money. And the other part of it is this sense that we're under such stress, and that while we think about the coronavirus as a big crisis, I think the global warming is an even bigger crisis, and the rise of authoritarianism and fundamentalism and the kind of hatred we see coming out of the Trump administration, the divisions. I think the coronavirus is helping us to see how we're all connected. And so that's the sort of the spiritual silver lining, you could say. The same is true for global warming, how there are not going to be local solutions to these global problems, and we're going to have to be more globalized. And at the same time, there's going to be so much stress. I've seen some estimates of 1 billion climate change refugees. That's over the next 50 years or so. That's going to be an enormous amount of suffering. So I think the role of psychedelics in both healing trauma, depression, anxiety, drug abuse, drug addiction, and also in providing these spiritual senses of connection, make me think that this sort of renaissance that we're involved in now, if we're careful, I don't see right now where the backlash is going to come from. I mean, there may be a backlash. I really devoted myself to psychedelics in 1972 when I was 18 years old, and that was shortly after the backlash against the 60s. And then I learned about MDMA in 82, started working politically to protect it in 83 and 84, and started MAPS in 86, but that was the backlash against MDMA during Nancy Reagan and just say no escalation of the drug war. So I'm very attuned to where there might be another backlash. but I don't actually see it coming. I think we have to be really, I think the thing that could be a problem is the exploitation of people for money if for-profit psychedelic development goes off the rails. And people start selling a bill of goods, and then people get paying money, and they get abused, or they don't get the benefits. That could be a problem. But overall, I think that the crises of today are pointing even more to the solutions and contributions that psychedelic therapy can make.
Yeah, totally. That's great to hear that you are not foreseeing such a big backlash.
Yeah, and maybe I should say that some people point to a potential backlash with the decriminalization efforts of psilocybin, becoming the lowest enforcement priority in Denver, or the decriminalized nature movements. There has been some portion of the psychedelic research community that's looked on those as scary kind of things to the DEA or to the FDA, and that the more they see policy initiatives that decriminalize or make low enforcement priorities, the fear has been that that will be a backlash against shutting down the research. And I think that is fundamentally misguided. I don't see that at all. And in fact, I think it's helpful. So I think the works to decriminalize, fundamentally, it's a human rights abuse, the drug war in the first place. It shouldn't, it should be medicalized, not criminalized. Anyway, the problem of drug abuse. And I think that we've got such stigma that we've overcome. So psychedelic therapy has been stigmatized, but we're overcoming that. And so now those of us working on psychedelic research are the conservative branches of the overall movement. The decrim are more, you could say, more controversial. And so they help legitimize what we're doing.
Mm.
And so I don't think that there's a conflict. I think those people that are worried that the decrim efforts, which are based a lot on their arguments, at least, or based on the data that we generate from clinical research, I really don't think that that's a threat. And I think we should embrace it for human rights reasons. But say that if we're going to medicalize, it has to be medicalized based on scientific data. And the big goal and the big difference between medicalization and decrim and legalization is that we want insurance companies to cover the treatments for people. And that will only happen by going through the FDA.
Yeah, totally. So obviously a theme at this conference besides psychedelics is technology. And obviously we're connecting now through technology. Technologies would kind of become dependent on it in a way never before. It's really the thing that's keeping us together and able to connect at all. And at consciousness hacking, we really, have this appreciation for the potential for technology to, if we do find a conscious, mindful way of relating to it and using it to really support healing and transformation. So I'm curious, as we move forward into the future and now, like, what role do you see technology playing in psychedelics and maybe in the mainstreaming of psychedelics?
Well, I'd say that's an area where I still need to be persuaded that there's going to be a major contribution. I mean, I see that there's, maybe we've all seen this. I've been watching the news, and you see these advertisements for Calm, for, technology to help people meditate. I think that those applications probably have a lot of benefit. There's also a lot of wearable technologies that can alert you to physiological states, that can actually potentially send signals to some data gathering systems that might alert you for when you might be coming to an emotional crisis of some sort. But I still remain to be persuaded about that, because I think that for PTSD, let's just say that PTSD is about a loss of faith in people. It's about people, now you can have PTSD from natural disasters, from accidents, but a lot of the PTSD is from sexual abuse, from domestic violence, from rape and assault, from war, from things that other people have done. So my sense is that the solution to this loss of trust in people is not going to come from a robot. It's not going to come from a chatbot. It will come from other people. And so I think the core of our element of our therapeutic approach will continue to be delivered by humans. I think that we've got a financial problem, a scalability problem. This is not a simple here's a drug and it will do the work. It will be accompanied by humans, and that is initially more expensive. And I think we have been able to demonstrate, not fundamentally yet, we have to finish phase 3 studies, but I think we've been able to demonstrate that in our phase 2 data that it's cost effective, that the outcomes that we're getting, the way in which people are no longer needing the same kind of treatments, the emergency room visits, things, the stress-related illnesses, I think we can make a cost effectiveness argument to get insurance coverage. What we're trying to do, we have a 2-person therapy team. One person will be licensed. We're still negotiating with FDA, but I think one person will be licensed therapist, the other can be a student working to get required hours. So that'll reduce the cost. As far as where I think technology can go, because of COVID, we've worked with the FDA and they've permitted us to turn the preparation sessions and the integration sessions to be done online through Zoom. So our core treatment is 3.5 months long. There's 3 MDMA sessions, 3 to 5 weeks apart. Those are 8 hours with a 2-person therapy team. Generally, people spend the night in the treatment session. There's integration work the next day. And then there's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 before the first MDMA session for preparation and 3 after each for integration. So the non-drug therapy sessions have all been turned on to Zoom right now. We don't think that they're as effective as being in person, but they're maybe 80% as effective. So they're not ineffective. They're just not quite as good. Plus, they have certain advantages in that they eliminate travel time and that they make it more convenient and less expensive for both therapists and patients to get that kind of treatment. But we've seen some people have been working with ketamine online while people are actually administering ketamine. Now, ketamine is a more internal experience. It's not as much of a dynamic psychotherapy during it. And so I think that that's been somewhat helpful as well. We've also tried, we tried this, we sort of pioneered it on bicycle night. So April 19th, not too long ago, was the 77th anniversary of the discovery of LSD. And we had a whole bunch of stuff online. And we decided we would try our psychedelic harm reduction program and to see if that worked online. So we had people standing by. We figured a bunch of people would probably be microdosing or macrodosing LSD on the 77th anniversary of the discovery of LSD, and a bunch of people did need some help. And they contacted, every room more or less had a button that's, peer support. And we found that worked pretty well. So that we've actually been able to, now that's not quite the same as therapy. I mean, peer support is important. You're helping people who are having difficult psychedelic experiences. They're not sure how to process the emotions. They're scared, they're isolated, they're alone sometimes. So the technology has helped us with the harm reduction. But we don't want to go to the actual therapy sessions through technology. I'll just say that this is very basic technology, but we've videotaped everything, all the therapy sessions, and then we have independent people that we've trained as adherence raters who can rate how well the therapists are adhering to the treatment method and give feedback. So that's happening through technology as well. But I think as far as wearables, I've yet to really learn enough to be persuaded.
Yeah, well, maybe this conference will provide some new examples, and I still need convincing too. But I think I'm glad you mentioned bicycle night, because that was really inspiring for us, and we're actually, our party tonight was inspired by that. We're doing something similar.
Oh, that's great to hear.
And let's see, where do I want to go with this? I think Tim Chang mentioned we can call it Paula story earlier, which you're familiar with, which kind of tells this somewhat dark story of a future where really the values of having an in-person therapy and that close connection are kind of taken over by technology and by an app, or an AI robot replaces actual therapist. And in many ways, that story felt very realistic, I think, to a lot of people. So how do we stop that? If that's kind of the direction we're headed, yeah, how do we prevent that or shift technology to actually support an awakened future, a better future, instead of that sort of darker vision?
Well, interestingly enough, I've seen earlier in the comments that there was another conference. There is another conference going on today that I spoke at earlier today, and one of the people that was there was one of the people involved with Atai, the holding company that's a major investor in Compass and all. But this fellow talked about trying to get rid of therapists and trying to do it as much as possible, electronically or at a distance, or develop new drugs that don't need therapists that you could do at home and things like that. So I think the way to respond to that is really going to have to be through outcomes. We're going to have to really compare outcomes. We're going to have to demonstrate that the outcomes we get with real people, even though it may initially be more expensive, are potentially more profound, deeper, more durable than the outcomes that come another way. So I think that's the real test, is the outcomes. And we all hope, because there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of people that are depressed, hundreds of millions of people that have drug abuse problems. There's 8 million people in the US that have PTSD, and sub-threshold PTSD. We have hundreds of millions around the world, that we all want to find new ways to help as many people as possible. So if we can leverage technology, we should do that. So I'm not opposed to that. In fact, I support that kind of experimentation. But I think that the real way to compare will be looking at our outcomes. The other thing I want to say is that this whole idea of, they call it Pala, came from a book called Island by Aldous Huxley. And he had this idyllic psychedelic society called Pala, and they had woven in psychedelics to the training of the young, to rites of passage, to helping people die, to throughout the course of one's lifetime. And it was this very interesting idyllic society. And in the end, the oil companies came into this island and destroyed it for mining, for taking out the oil. So the message from that, and I'd say the message from, they call it Pala as well, is that we cannot develop these kind of private utopias somewhere. We have to go to the heart of the system and change from the inside out. That the world is so interconnected now. There's no healing without healing from the center out. And so what I think that also means is the business community. We all need to earn a living, things like that. So that I think we do have to be engaging with for-profit psychedelic development. I'm in favor of it, but I do think we need nonprofit examples. So like what Tim was talking about in terms of North Star. I think we model best behavior, and that will impact how other entities that are more profit focused may act. And the other thing is just to say, Tim also talked about these different corporate structures. So, our corporate structure, we have about 80 people right now. We have about 55 people in the Benefit Corporation, that's our pharmaceutical company arm, and about 25 people in the nonprofit. But the nonprofit is the 100% owner in the for-profit Public Benefit Corporation. And we have been turning down investors, even though that means that we have a major fundraising challenge through donors. But the reason that part of the story is that that the nonprofit sector created the new changes. It took decades and decades and decades, from MAPS, from the Hefter Institute, the Beckley Foundation in England, that the nonprofit sector really created the social change that made it possible for for-profit actors to think that there was a reasonable opportunity for progress and profit. And so I think what we're trying to say is that we need to continue the nonprofit sector into the future, as we will be then models for good behavior. So I think that that's on our challenge. And that's why we're trying to really turn down investors. I mean, it would be very simple for us to fund the thing, but then you get into all those incentives like maximize profit. What's the minimal amount of therapy you can do? What's the most you can charge for the drug? And our basic view is the world's on fire. We are in dire need of healing. The human species is on a self-destruct path, the environment is on a self-destruct path, the global warming, the extinctions. It's just a terribly challenging time. And so I think the goal for us is really to promote mass mental health, and to do that in a way that thinks more collectively than individually. So there needs to be, people can't self-sacrifice themselves, and then what good is that? But it's really about helping people heal themselves and moving forward in a decriminalized, legalized context, as well as a medicalized context, as well as in religious freedom context.
Yeah, it's really it's a big challenge. Like you're saying, it's a double challenge of not just the radical, controversial idea of just of psychedelics in itself,
Yeah.
but actually creating these new systems to really support it too. I love that you mentioned Island. One of the things I love about that book is that it depicts a kind of utopian society that has integrated both psychedelics, but also also what I think are the best things from kind of Eastern spiritual traditions, which kind of gets me into the third theme of this conference, which is meditation. And when we say meditation here, we're really referring to contemplative spiritual traditions that are around training the mind, yoga, mindfulness. And obviously these things originally come from mostly the Eastern spiritual traditions. And we've seen over the last few years, mindfulness and yoga, kind of similarly to what we're seeing with psychedelics, now become totally mainstream and taken out of their traditional context. And similarly, we're seeing that with psychedelics, which is like a lot of the medicines, of course, not all of them, but not MDMA, but many of the medicines have this traditional shamanic context. And I guess I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about like how important is that traditional context, and what is lost when we're with mainstreaming, when we're taking these medicines out of that context, and what can be done to kind of preserve the best elements of that.
Well, let me say this, that I grew up in the Jewish tradition, and we're Reform Jews. And so the obligation in the Reform tradition is that you take the traditions from the past and you reinterpret them to what you need in the present. So you don't have, so people have talked about cultural appropriation. We've taken, people are using ayahuasca in the US, but not in the traditional exact traditional context. Is that inappropriate? Is that cultural appropriation? The answer for me is fundamentally no, because there's this romantic ideal that, oh, it's from Brazil and that's somehow pure indigenous, but it's not pure at all. It's they're called syncretic religions. They're merged with the Catholic Church. They've had to accommodate to the power structures in South America. The ayahuasca churches tend to be patriarchal, hierarchical, homophobic. They're not the exact model that we want to bring forth into the US. So I think we need respect for where things came from. There's an incredible wisdom in the indigenous use of these things that have been honed over centuries, thousands of years, of how they use these plant-based medicines. And we can learn a lot from them. But at the same time, for example, there was a study with ayahuasca for depression in Brazil, in a hospital without a religious ceremony at all, and they got really good results. So I think it's sort of, it's the planetary inheritance rather than the inheritance of the groups that initially discovered them. So I think we need to be back to, honoring where these things came from, trying to pay back somehow or other, but reinterpreting for what we're doing. So I think a lot of times I just think that I'm really glad that MDMA came from the lab, that it doesn't have a tradition, that people are like, oh, why don't you do it this way or that way? We can create it ourselves. So I think that's really important. So it's honoring the past, but not being a slave to the past. And I think that's really our obligation. And also making things culturally appropriate in the different cultures that you use it. The other thing that I want to say about meditation is that when psychedelics were really in the 60s, And when the Beatles, for example, went to India and came back with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and transcendental meditation, and you got these guys in white robes, and they're looking really weird, and they don't feel from our own culture. It's kind of this sort of importation. And then when the crackdown happened against psychedelics, a bunch of people said, all right, psychedelics take you to somewhere, but then you come back down. You need something to integrate it, all of which is true. And now we're giving up psychedelics and we're going to meditate. So there was kind of this divergence of those relatively few people that were still open to psychedelics, and those other people that were more, let's embrace meditation. And they tended to have this dismissive attitude towards psychedelics. That, okay, yes, it can start what you're doing, but then give it up. You don't need it. So what I'm so excited about now is the coming together of the meditation community and the psychedelics community. And I'd say Alan Bediner did a great job in his book Zigzag Zen, which is about psychedelics and Zen. But there's a study that was just published recently that was done by a fellow named Vanya Palmers, and it was done at a Zen meditation center in Switzerland. And this was in collaboration with Franz Vollenweider at the University of Zurich. It took lifelong meditators who'd given up psychedelics for decades. They went into the University of Zurich for brain scans. Then they went into a 5-day meditation retreat. In the middle, you end up, all of them got a pill, either psilocybin or a placebo, and while they were meditating. And then afterwards, after that 5-day retreat is over, they had all sorts of measurements. They go back for more brain scans. They had long-term measures. And then they did a crossover for those people that got the placebo. Then they could do it again with psilocybin. But what they found is lifelong meditators benefited from a psilocybin experience. And it helped deepen their meditation practice and gave them kind of a new goalpost or a new experience that they could aim towards in their meditation practice. So they could integrate during meditation, but what it demonstrated is that it's not two different paths, the psychedelic path, the meditation path, that even those people who are meditating occasionally can benefit from a psychedelic experience. So I think we're seeing that the quote spiritual meditation community is now validating the benefits from psychedelics. So it's a tremendous thing. And the same is true with the mindfulness community. Like Wisdom 2.0, the conferences, just a couple years ago, I got invited, and so did Michael Pollan, to speak there. And it was because they felt comfortable enough that mindfulness had been integrated enough, now they could weave back in the psychedelics. So I think we need to find these integrative approaches. That's what really is so important. And so I think there is a role for meditation. And I would also just say that when you're a psychedelic therapist, for MDMA, for psilocybin, it's 6-8 hour sessions. And much of the time, the people have their eyes closed, they're having an inner experience. For MDMA, of the 8 hours, more or less half of it is talking with the therapist, half is inner. For psilocybin or LSD, it's more like 90% of the time people are inner and the rest talking to their therapist. So as a psychedelic therapist, you're sitting there and you're not engaged in dialogue. So that's where meditative skills come in very handy for the psychedelic therapist, to be able to be quiet, to be able to work with intuition, with feelings, to read body language, to do all that. And at the same time, to be present when needed for the other person, when they emerge from that. So I think there's a lot of benefit that psychedelic therapists get from that knowledge of how do you be quiet or quiet your inner mind while you're holding space. So I think that's where it can come in. And then I think a lot of people can use meditation for integration. But I would also say that one of the best tools for integration, which we don't really talk about as much as we should, I think, is dreams. Is that the psychedelic content moves from the psychedelic experience into people's dreams. And a lot of us, rush to wake up by an alarm, and then we do stuff, the dreams fade. So I think there's just a lot of potential for integration in dreams. And I do look very much forward to this integration of psychedelics, mindfulness, and meditation in new treatment approaches.
Awesome. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So we have about 8-ish minutes left. So I'm going to move to some of our audience questions. So people haven't had a chance to vote. You can go on to meet.ps now and vote up your top questions. So right now, the top question is a question about group psychedelic therapy,
Right.
such as psychedelic retreats. How do these, maybe you could talk a little bit about benefits of those versus individual therapy, but also how that affects legalization efforts.
Hmm. Well, okay, the easiest question is how do they affect legalization efforts? And I think that they are positive. I mean, the base of people in our culture that have had these kind of experiences, whether individually or in groups, is growing. And so the enormous amount of fear and misinformation and propaganda and demonizing and stigmatizing is slowly diminishing. And so I think it diminishes in proportion to the number of people that have had these experiences directly, and they know what they're getting in for. They know the reality of it. So that's been really important. There was just a very interesting study that I saw from the Veterans Administration. I had always thought that group therapy is not as effective as individual therapy for people that are traumatized, for people that are depressed. I mean, you see group therapy for, AA and other kind of things. There's supportive group therapy. So we're very interested in exploring group therapy as a way to reduce costs. I think that in certain kind of situations with PTSD, people need to tell their story, and they need to tell it when they're feeling safe, and that sharing their story is in a way reprocessing the memories. And I think there's not as much of that in the group sessions. For a while, we were trying to do research with ayahuasca for PTSD. And we talked to several of the ayahuasca churches in the United States that were legal. And we thought, okay, let's bring a bunch of vets or other people with PTSD to these ayahuasca sessions. And what they said was that they didn't feel it was the right context, that people might need more support. They need to really let go and scream or let out the fear or shake. And it's in a group session, you're kind of focused on keeping in sync with the group to some extent. I mean, the kind of ayahuasca sessions that I like the most are where you're in this group setting, but there's a little space where you can go off if you want to by your own and just lie down for a while and process individually. So that move from individual to group. And these religious groups, they emphasize group over individual, and that can be problematic. But I think that one of the top areas for us to explore is going to be group therapy.
Thank you. We talked about this a little bit, when you shared your doubts about technology, but there's a question about if you think it's possible to develop a compassionate AI that could, sometime in the future, really help people through psychotherapy sessions. Because we have this problem of scale, right? Really needing and money and the time is short. So if this could really be done, could you see that happening?
Well, I hope people continue to explore it, and if they develop it. But I think the scaling problem is something that we will be able to address, in that we are going to be ramping up our training program for training therapists. We now think MDMA will be a medicine the end of 2022, if we can start treating people again. We're going to need tens of thousands of therapists, and that will be a challenge. But I think that we can scale up the training programs for that. We've got like 6,000 therapists have contacted us about going through the training program. Whether you can do this individually, again, my thing is about PTSD is it's about a loss of faith in people. Somebody generally, now natural disasters, things like that are a different story. But for much of it, if you have lost your faith in people, I don't know how you gain it back without interacting with trustworthy people.
Yeah. So there's a good question about some of these organizations now in the psychedelic scene are trying to isolate some of the effects from and diminish the psychedelic effects, right? And just isolate they call the psychedelic experience like the side effects, and just isolate the more neurobiological medical effects. Can you say anything about that? And do you feel like that's how you feel about that approach?
I have very little patience for that approach. For example, 18MC. 18MC is the non-psychedelic ibogaine, and it may indeed help people reduce craving. But how do you prevent relapse? There's psychological issues that people need to address. So I really don't think that the psychedelic experience is a side effect. In fact, it's where a lot of the healing comes from. So I think it's from people that are telling stories for building up their stock price. But let them do that. Whatever can be done by whatever methods for healing, we're about the healing. If there's different ways to do it, you take a pill and it changes your chemistry and you're not PTSD and you didn't have a psychedelic effect, well, great. Let people do that. But I'm called for this fundamental incorporation of the psychedelic experience. It's been key to my personal growth. It's been used for thousands of years. I don't think we need to design it out of the system. And I don't think that a lot of these stories are going to really bear fruit as much as people are hyping them. But I will say, for example, with cluster headaches. So the people that have cluster headaches, which is the worst cluster headache, it's terrible. And the group clusterbusters.com, they inadvertently discovered that psilocybin or LSD blocks the cycle of cluster headaches. And so they came to us, this is 15 years ago, and said, we don't want to be criminals. Can you do some research? And we did a bunch of research here at Harvard Medical School and gathered records. And it turned out that it's really true, that it does seem that with medical records, psilocybin or LSD break the cycle of cluster headaches. So then we went to the people at Harvard, said we want to study LSD. And they said, no, only as the last resort. And so a couple of the doctors there said, okay, we're going to work with bromo LSD. And we will do a study with bromo LSD, which is the non-psychedelic version of LSD, and we'll show that we'll see if it works for cluster headaches, and it probably won't work, and then we'll be back to using LSD as the last resort. Well, as it turned out, bromo LSD works better than LSD or psilocybin. So we don't know why LSD or psilocybin work for cluster headaches, but we do know that with LSD, you give it in micrograms. With psilocybin, it's milligrams. But with bromo LSD, that's not psychedelic. You just give grams and grams of people to people, and whatever it does it even better. So there are certain circumstances where a non-psychedelic version of a psychedelic will be even better for certain kind of things. But cluster headaches is not something that you're doing therapy. It's a physiological thing that you're fixing.
Totally. Well, I think that we are actually out of time.
Oh, darn it. This has been great.
If I'm correct, I think you are leading a deep dive session at some point today or tomorrow, or no?
I'm not aware of that. I'm not opposed to it, but I'll have to talk to Liana about that.
I'll have to check on that. It'll be posted on meet.px.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. It's really great. I'm glad to spend time with everybody.
Thank you so much for the work you're doing.